What's up everyone, welcome to another tier list video, and this is probably going to be my last one for a while, but I see a lot of people make different tier lists for different aspects of the Persona and Megami Tensei series, not just the quality of the games, but other things like the characters, the music, the artwork, so I figured why not do one myself, and the topic that I decided to do was ranking the playable characters in the Persona series. That's right, I am going to be ranking all the playable characters throughout the entire series based on a variety of factors like their personas, what moves they learn, when in the game you get them, and all of these factors are going to be purely based on the gameplay aspects of these games, not how I feel about the characters themselves. So if one of your guys' waifus or husbandos gets put in a low tier, I apologize, but that doesn't mean I hate them as a character. It just means I don't think they're as useful as the other characters gameplay-wise, and to be fair, I don't really think there are any characters that I would say are totally useless, but some of them are better than others. I'm also only going to be looking at the mainline Persona games, and like I said, I'm only looking at fully controllable party members. Navigators do not count, unless you count the ones that become playable later, like Teddy and Mitsuru, but I'm not going to be thinking about that for this list. Without further ado, let's get on with the video. But first, a word from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Factor. Are you tired of being charged exorbitant amounts of money for mediocre food through delivery services? Do you want something good, something healthy, something that's made specifically for you? Well, then I highly recommend you check out Factor. Factor is a dietary subscription service that delivers chef-prepared dietitian-designed meals right to your doorstep up to 18 times a week. And there's several different plans for you to choose from, such as Keto, Calorie Smart, Vegetarian, Vegan, Protein Plus, and many more. Plus, with Factor, not only can you get these meals, but also sides, drinks, and desserts, all of which are also made to cater directly to you. And if you aren't sure which of these meals is right for you, you can talk with a registered dietitian for free, and they can give you advice on how to meet your health goals. If you check out the link down below in the description and use the coupon code on screen, you will receive a special unique discount. Whether you want to get healthy or are just looking for some quality food, there's no better choice than Factor. I want to give a big thanks to Factor for sponsoring this video, and now, let's get back to the video. Okay, so I'm going to be going by game in order of release, but let's just get the obvious choices out of the way. All the wildcards are going to be put in the double S tier. It's pretty much the only reason I included this tier at all, and I even debated including these characters at all, but I figured if I'm going to be including the older Persona protagonists, yeah, I should probably include the wildcards too. Now, I shouldn't have to explain why they're here, but yeah, it's the wildcards. In Persona 3 onward, they made it so that only the protagonist could use multiple personas, while everyone else was limited to just one. This was a pretty big change from the earlier games where everyone could use multiple personas, but you had limitations with persona compatibility, and this applied to all party members, including the protagonist. Here, you get an entire compendium of personas at your disposal, and there aren't really any drawbacks, so yeah, wildcards all go in the highest tier. Now that that's out of the way, let's move on to the real stuff, and we'll start with the Persona 1 protagonist, aka Boy with Earring, aka Naoya, and despite him not having the wildcard, he's still, in my opinion, the best party member in Persona 1, so I'm going to put him just below the other protagonists in S tier. For one thing, despite him not being a wildcard, it does help that you can fully customize his stats with every level up, which is another thing they got rid of with Persona 3. But his starting persona, Seimon Kongo, is pretty good, and he has high compatibility with the World, the Strength, and the Moon Arcanas, just to name a few, which have some of the best personas in the game. What really puts him up here, though, is his ultimate persona, Amon-Ra, which is pretty much a necessity for beating the final boss of the Sebek route. I remember not really having much difficulty with the game up until the final boss, but once I got Amon-Ra, that pretty much made the final boss a joke. Alright, let's move on to Maki, and Maki is pretty good. Being a character that's not the main character, you can't do anything to alter her growth pattern, which does have good dexterity, but mostly favors agility. Her starting persona is great, and her ultimate persona is decent too. The only weakness Maki really has is her equipment. The weapons she gets are bows and handguns, which are pretty bad, but she does have low strength, and you're not really going to want to be using her for physical attacks anyway. You're going to want to use her as a magic user and a healer. So yeah, I thought about putting her in A, but considering that she's only available in the Sebek route, I feel like that alone is enough to bump her down to B, so that's where she's gonna be. Up next, we have K, or Nate in the PS1 version, and unlike Maki, he actually is available in both quests, but he's not really super amazing. His stat growth isn't really anything spectacular, and his persona compatibility is very similar to that of the protagonist, which isn't really that ideal considering that in the Sebek route he's actually a required party member. His starting and ultimate personas are okay, and in fact his starting persona gives you early access to some buff skills, but really, he's just a not as good version of the protagonist. The only thing I'd say he has better than the protagonist is his weapon selection, so I'm just gonna put him in C. Alright, now on to Mark, or Masao, and I vividly remember Mark being a valuable asset to my team the last time I played Persona 1, mainly because of his strength and weapon selection. His persona selection really isn't that impressive, it's another deal where it's kinda similar to the protagonist, but his superior strength and weapon selection, along with him being the only character in the game with high compatibility with the Chariot Arcana, make him an ideal physical attacker. In fact, I remember when my party was low on HP, which, to be fair, doesn't happen that much in Persona 1, but when it did, Mark pretty much carried my party through random encounters because he was doing so much more physical damage than everyone else with his normal attacks. It's for this reason I don't recommend going for a physical build if you're doing the Sebek route, because Mark will have you covered, and I think that earns him his spot in the A tier. Okay, now Brown is the character I imagine was the optional party member that most people use their first time playing Persona 1, because he's the first one that asks to join your party, and I doubt most players would say no to that, unless they knew that doing so would prevent you from getting the other ones, but for what it's worth, Brown is a decent party member. His stat growth has him specialize in both strength and magic, making him a decent jack-of-all-trades character, and most of his Arcana's personas specialize in nothing but attacking. I would say this could pose a problem, but most of his shortcomings will be covered by other characters anyway. If you want a character that works as both a magic and a physical attacker, he's not a bad choice, but if you ask me, he is still one of the weaker characters in the game, so I'm going to put him in C tier. Okay, now we move on to Ellie, and Ellie was the character that I chose to use in my most recent run of the game, and she's not bad. Ellie is another character with mostly balanced stats, only this time they're balanced all across the board, putting her in a similar boat to Brown, although her starting persona, Nike, is amazing for the point in the game that you get it, and that goes for the other personas in her Arcana as well, with a wide variety of strong physical magic, support, and healing moves. Overall, not a bad choice as the 5th character on your team, so yeah, I'm gonna put her in B. Now on to Ayase, and I'll be honest, Ayase is probably the character that I've used the least in this game. She's required for the Snow Queen quest, but she is an optional party member in the Sebek quest, but I've never taken her with me. Her stats favor strength and magic once again, except neither of those are her preferred stat. That would be her luck stat, which, you know, isn't really the best stat to be investing in most Megaton games, and her personas aren't really anything special either. Not to mention, her equipment is on the weaker side too. I wouldn't go as far as to say she's a bad character, but she is probably the worst playable character in the game gameplay-wise, and I'm gonna put her in D. Okay, now on to Yukino, the other required character for the Snow Queen quest, and in fact the only character that you can only get in the Snow Queen quest. Yukino has a similar stat distribution to Maki, specializing in agility, only instead of magic, she now favors strength. Her personas, though, seem to lean more toward her being a magic attacker, which is fine. I mean, her magic stat isn't horrible, and in fact, those personas actually provide some decent coverage, which can be useful, especially early in the game, but generally, you're better off equipping her with personas outside of her Arcana, and her melee weapons are still on the weaker side. But at least she has access to shotguns, which are always good. Not a bad character, but still one of the weaker ones in my opinion, so I'm gonna put her in C. Last but not least, we have Reiji, who is a decent character, but he is a colossal pain in the neck to get. In fact, you're probably not even going to know that he's a playable character unless you're religiously following a guide, which doesn't seem like much now, but imagine playing this game as a kid in 1996 with limited or no internet. Now, once you do get him, Reiji is okay. His stat growth heavily favors strength, but the best thing about him is that he has not one, but 2 Arcanas that only he has best compatibility with. although both of these arcanas are very limited, but his starting persona is arguably the best in the game, and while his melee weapons have terrible coverage, they do some pretty good damage, and his firearms are pretty good too. Reiji is a decent character, but I don't know if the amount of effort you have to go through to get him is worth it. And you can't even get him at all during the Snow Queen quest, so I was going to put him in B, but his limitation to just one path and the difficulty of getting him makes me feel the need to bump him down to C. Okay, now let's move on to good old Persona 2, starting with Innocent Sin, starting with Tatsuya, and I'm gonna put him next to his friend Naoya in S, for many of the same reasons. He's a protagonist, meaning you can customize his stats in any way you want, and because dexterity is even more broken than it was in Persona 1, yeah, go nuts with it. While Tatsuya's starting persona isn't anything amazing, it does get much better when upgraded to its prime form, and the other personas he gets are pretty good too, so yeah, that's why I'm putting him in S. Moving on to Lisa, or Ginkgo as the game calls her. I don't know why they actually changed her name to that in the menus, but now, I love Lisa, but admittedly she is kind of lame in battle. Her stat growth heavily seems to favor agility, and if you're using mostly personas that she has high compatibility with, their stats are just going to further contribute to her agility even more. These personas do have decent movesets, but with her stats being extremely lacking in every other department except agility, there isn't really much you can do with them. The only way you can alleviate this is by giving her personas that provide bonuses to dexterity or strength when leveling up, but most of these personas she doesn't even have good compatibility with, so you either have to go with a crappy stat distribution or bad compatibility personas, and that's just not ideal. So sadly, and I love you Lisa, but I'm gonna have to put you in the D tier. Fortunately, the exact opposite is true for Akechi, who pours most of his stat bonuses into strength, which makes him an ideal physical attacker, and the personas that he has the best compatibility with provide bonuses to this. It's not uncommon for Akechi to have nearly 99 strength by the end of the game, which is just great, and another reason to give Tatsuya a dexterity build since Akechi will have you covered in the physical department. His personas aren't bad either, and one thing that's cool is that he's the only character in the game that can equip Beelzebub. Granted, he does have bad compatibility with him, but it's still neat, and I definitely think Akechi deserves a spot in A. Maya, my beloved, I am going to put you in B. Maya is another similar case to Lisa, where she favors agility, though it's nowhere near as bad as Lisa, and Maya thankfully has decent growth in dexterity. Not to mention, her personas are better, and Maya actually does have good compatibility with personas that provide dexterity bonuses upon leveling up. Part of me wants to put her higher, but you do still kind of have to go out of your way to make Maya into the ideal party member, and her weapon selection isn't that good either, so I'm just gonna keep her up here in B. Okay, once again, we have Yukino, who makes a return from Persona 1, and her build mostly favors vitality with a tiny bit of strength. Now, normally I would say that this isn't bad, but given how mindlessly weak the enemies are in Innocent Sin, it hardly even matters, and her strength doesn't do much to make up for this either, given how she's largely outclassed by Akechi. The worst part, though, is that her personas don't even do much with her strength stats. The majority of them have mostly magic and healing moves, which doesn't work well with Yukino's low magic stat. I was honestly thinking about putting her in D, but at least she's only with you for half the game, so I'm just going to be nice and put her next to herself from Persona 1 in the C tier. Now on to June, the character who replaces Yukino halfway into the game, and thankfully June's stats are not only much better, but they're also much more balanced. June's stats are, like I said, mostly balanced, with him slightly favoring dexterity, which is great, and his personas are much better overall. Though, like I said, the game is already halfway over by the time you get him, and it's the only thing keeping him from the A tier, but he definitely more than deserves his spot in B. Now, that's it for Innocent Sin, but we're not done with Persona 2 just yet, because we still have Eternal Punishment, and Maya, you know, protagonist, fully customizable stats, although I actually think Maya's personas are better than Tatsuya's and benefit from a full dexterity build even more, but I don't think that alone should bring her up to double S, so I'm going to keep her in S with the rest of the classic Persona protagonists. Now we have Ulala, who also has a very similar growth pattern to Lisa, although hers isn't quite as bad with her having a little more variety, and her personas do have better movesets too, but overall she does share many of the same weaknesses, and I wouldn't put her in a higher tier, so she's just gonna have to sit next to Lisa in D. Up next is Katsuya, also my beloved, and he has a very similar growth pattern to Akechi. Although, similarly to Ulala, who wasn't quite as bad as Lisa, Katsuya isn't quite as good as Akechi. While he does largely favor strength, his overall stat growth is a little more balanced, which can be a good thing depending on how you look at it, but as a powerful physical attacker, Katsuya just doesn't cut it as well as Akechi does, and his personas and weapons aren't quite as good either. And in this case, I actually think that is enough to bump him down a tier, so I'm going to put him in B. Now we move on to Baofu, and he's not bad, but unlike the other characters that I've talked about so far for P2, Baofu actually kind of seems to favor luck as his most favored stat, which isn't great. At least that seems to be the case if you stick to personas of his own arcana, but at least you can still easily have him use other arcanas to alleviate this. But really, he's kind of just a slightly weaker version of Katsuya, but he is still better than Ulala, so I'm going to put him between the two in the C tier. Now, Ellie and Kay, I'm both going to put in the B tier because while they're good party members, there's not really a lot I can say because they're not with you for very long, and they both have very similar builds to what they did in Persona 1. They're pretty much just temporary party members, and you can't get both of them the same playthrough. Again, they're good, but there's not much point in investing in them because by the time you've actually started to work on their stats and moves and whatnot, they're gone, and the personas and stats and equipment that they start with are more than viable. Lastly, we have Tatsuya, who doesn't come in until close to the end of the game, but he is an amazing party member with some really solid stats all around, and access to some pretty good personas and equipment. Now, because of how late he joins, I normally would only put him in B with Eriko and Kay, but he also helps you out a bit early in the game as well. Plus, there's also the additional scenarios in the PSP version of Eternal Punishment where you play as him, and that's pretty cool. So yeah, I'm going to put Tatsuya in A. Alright, now we finally move on to the Hashino Persona games, and I already ranked the pro tags, so let's start with Yukari, and yeah, we're off to a strong start. I'm going to put Yukari in A. This is mainly because Yukari is exactly what you would want from a magic user in Persona 3. A build that heavily favors magic with a good variety of strong magic and healing moves. While she's not the only character that learns healing skills throughout the game, she does learn them at an earlier level than most of the other characters, making her an ideal healer. And in most of my playthroughs of the game, she's almost always been on my final team. Now, Junpei is kind of a tough one to place on here because his persona and stats aren't really anything too impressive. He specializes in fire magic, but you don't really want to rely on his magic attacks since his stats favor strength, and they're not even really all that helpful in the early parts of the game since Orpheus gets fire magic moves too, but Junpei does have a decent variety of physical attacks, which is great in P3 because of how physical attacks are divided into 3 types. And he also gets a Vorpal Blade, which is arguably the best physical move in the game. However, what Junpei really excels at is in his critical rate. When Junpei is in great condition and or you've used Revolution on the party, Junpei is a critical hit machine, and it almost eliminates the need for coverage at all. This is under very specific circumstances though, but Junpei is still a decent party member normally, so I'm going to put him in B. Up next is Akihiko, and this is also kind of a tough one because Akihiko is another one of those jack-of-all-trades characters, but despite that, I always seem to get good use out of him, and he usually finds a way into my final party. Maybe this is because almost every move he learns is good and really benefits whatever role you may need him for. He gets all the single and multi-target debuffing moves, he learns all the single-target healing moves, and he gets not only electric skills but also both of the boosters. He is lacking in physical moves, but he does have access to some great equipable weapons, and I definitely think he earns his spot in A. Now, Mitsuru I know is a popular party member, but I've never really gotten any great use out of her, and I rarely ever use her on my final team. She has similar stats to Yukari, but her magic stat isn't quite as high, even though she's meant to be more of a magic-focused attacker. She only gets single target healing moves and also a bunch of useless moves that don't really help, like Marin Karin, which she likes to spam unless you change her tactics, but also moves like Mind Charge, which is kinda useless in Persona 3, along with Spirit Drain, which is one of the worst moves in the game. The only thing that she really has going over Yukari is the fact that she gets the booster skills, so if you really need a strong magic user for your team, Mitsuru isn't a bad choice, but for most of the other roles, there are just better characters. Speaking of, we have Aegis, who I'm going to put in the B tier. Now, originally I was going to put her in A, but the more I thought about it, the more it hit me that Aegis isn't really super amazing as a character in combat. Granted, she's usually a part of my team for a solid chunk of the game, but this is mainly because she's the only party member that gets the full party buffing skills, which make a much bigger difference than the multi-target debuffing skills. But other than that, she doesn't really have a whole lot going for her. She specializes in Vitality, which isn't the best stat to specialize in Persona 3. She also has almost nothing in the way of magic coverage, which is kind of funny considering that her magic stat isn't that far behind her strength stat. The only thing she has really going for her besides the buffs is Samarikar, but you're probably not going to be using her as a healer anyway, so yeah, it pains me to do this, but I guess you're going in B. Alright, now Ken, I'm gonna put you here. Ken is another jack-of-all-trades character, and I honestly find him to be pretty underrated. I hadn't used him much until when I started using him for my Orpheus-only run, where I used him in place of Yukari, and he actually did a decent job. He's the only character besides Yukari that gets full party healing moves, and he even gets some physical moves, and his light and electric moves are nice too. I wouldn't say he's a better member than Yukari, but if you really just hate Yukari so much that you won't even use her, or you want two healers on your team, Ken is a decent alternative. Alright, who's next? Oh yeah, Koromaru, and I'll be honest guys, I've hardly used Koromaru at all throughout all of my runs of Persona 3. This is mainly because, really just by the time he joins, I already have pretty much all my bases covered, and I don't really have the need or the room for what Koromaru does, which is a fast magic attacker with dart moves. I mean, yeah, those can be helpful sometimes, but his stats really aren't that impressive and don't do much to complement his moveset. Also, and this is kind of a personal thing, but I love dogs, and it's just hard for me to feel comfortable using a dog in battle. I mean, yeah, he has a persona, but just fighting with a Shiba Inu, which is a pretty small breed, doesn't feel right. Maybe if he was a bigger breed like a German Shepherd or a Pit Bull or a Rottweiler or something, I'd feel better about it, but yeah, Koromaru is going to be going in C. Alright, now on to Shinjiro, and okay guys, I love Shinjiro, but as a party member, he's not that great. And this is in no small part because, spoilers for an almost 20-year-old game, he dies not long after joining the party, but even for a temporary member, he's not really all that impressive. He doesn't have much in the way of attacks, he has absolutely nothing in the way of magic coverage, and by the time you get him, there are just better choices. If it's not your first time playing, you're probably not even going to want to use him on your team anyway because you know he's just going to die within a month. The only thing preventing him from being lower is that his persona has no weakness, which is pretty cool, but I still don't think I can put him any higher than C. Oh, and I can't believe I almost forgot this, but yeah, Answer Aegis is going in double S with all the other wild cards. Now that's it for the party of base Persona 3, but we still have one more character, that being Metis from the Answer, and I think I'm gonna put her in A. Now, Metis is basically Shinjiro 2.0, like she has similar stats, they both use the same weapons, and her persona has no weakness, but in addition to being able to use her for most of the entirety of the Answer, she also has a great move pool with some great coverage in both physical and magic attacks. The only real downside is that her magic stat isn't that great, and she also, like Mitsuru, spams Marin Karin a lot unless you change her strategy in the tactics menu. But as an enjoyer of the Answer, I have no problem putting Metis in A. Alright, now we move on to Persona 4, and this one won't take long because Persona 4 has one of the smaller casts in the series, starting with Yosuke, who is pretty good. Yosuke is a balanced character, but he's the perfect balanced character because his growth favors all stats except luck. Now, his moveset isn't anything super amazing. He's kind of like Akihiko in that he's got a little bit of healing, a little bit of physical moves, a little bit of magic, and a little bit of buffs. But for the early game, he's great, and for the late game, he's not a bad choice either. Brave Blade is definitely helpful, although his third tier persona ability isn't great, but Yosuke is definitely worthy of the B tier. Now, Chie... I almost put Chie in the A tier, mainly because of her galactic punt ability, which is pretty much an insta-kill for a single enemy, which you get halfway into the first dungeon, mind you, but also because of her critical rate. Much like Junpei, Chie will be scoring a lot of critical hits, and this is even further helped by her getting Apt Pupil in Golden. I would also say her third tier move, Dragon Hustle, is good, but it's just way too costly, even for the end of the game. Overall, she's a decent physical attacker with some good physical moves, but she's not the best in that category. That honor goes to Kanji. Kanji is basically Chie, but better. He has better stats and better moves, including Primal Force, which is the strongest attack in the game. Period. That alone, I think, is enough to bring him up to A, but on top of that, he learns Mataru Kaja, although you're probably going to want someone else to buff him because you'll want to use all of Kanji's turns to attack. Kanji is a perfect example of how one or two moves can make or break a character, and his Primal Force skill is the main reason he's here in A. Now, I did go a little out of order, but let's put Yukiko on here somewhere, and I think I'm going to put Yukiko in A. Yukiko is very similar to Yukari in terms of stats and moveset, but she's actually arguably better. She has even less growth in strength compared to Yukari, which is great, but she also gets both the booster skills for her element, and even learns Salvation late in the game. Plus, her third tier persona from Golden gets Burning Petals, making her the only character besides the protagonist to get a multi-target severe elemental damage move, and she definitely deserves to be here in A. Alright, where was I? Oh yeah, Teddy. Teddy, you are an annoying sack of crap that looks stupid, sounds stupid, and I absolutely freaking hate you, but you are at least a good party member. His stats are pretty good, he has some decent healing moves, along with Maraku Kaja, making him a good supporting character and healer, and a good ice move user and replacement for Chie. Plus, he actually does have some advantages over Yukiko, like he learns more ailment healing skills, including Amrita, but he never learns Salvation. And that, I would say, is the one thing preventing him from being an A tier, but he does earn a very high spot in B. And lastly, from Persona 4, we have Naoto, who... yeah, I think y'all saw this one coming. Naoto is another good all-around character with a great moveset and extremely helpful for late in the game. She gets both fire and wind skills, along with dark and light skills, along with both the boosters, some physical skills, both reflector skills, and even almighty skills. And that is awesome. The only department she's lacking in is buffs and healing moves, but by the time you get here, this will already be covered better by other allies anyway. Naoto is the perfect party member for blasting your way through the random encounters in the rest of the game. I will say she's not really ideal for boss fights, but I don't think that alone is enough to bump her down to B tier, so I'm going to keep her in A. Alright, finally, we're in the last game, Persona 5, and Ryuji is going to be in C. Ryuji isn't all that good, and I pretty much stopped using him once Yusuke came along. This is mainly because while he's a decent physical attacker, he misses a lot, and every time that happens, I have to listen to Morgana calling him pathetic. He's not terrible, but he is one of the weaker party members in P5, and the only thing that's really preventing him from being lower is the fact that he learns God Hand, which is one of the strongest moves in the game, although good luck landing a hit with it. Oh, and also his third tier move from Royal, Fighting Spirit, which is basically power charge for the entire party, and that's great. Alright, and speaking of annoying pieces of crap that I freaking hate, Morgana. who I am actually going to put in the D tier, and I promise this isn't because of how I feel about him as a character, but I actually do think he is the worst party member in the game. For one thing, he has some of the worst equipment in the game. Like, all the other characters use guns while he uses slingshots, and his melee weapons aren't particularly good either. There's also the fact that while he has some decent healing moves, his defense is so low that on higher difficulties, it's like 1 or 2 hits and he's dead. He also gets some physical moves which are pretty useless, and that's also true for his 3rd tier move. Just how do you manage to make a character that's not only annoying but also terrible in battle? Okay, let's move on to Panther, and she will be in B. The best way to describe her is like Yukiko, but not quite as good. Although she does have some advantages, like her sleep ailment moves, which have saved my butt a good number of times. She also gets Tarunda, which is extremely helpful against the first boss. She gets a multi-target severe elemental move, and her 3rd tier skill is High Energy, which applies Mind Charge to everyone, so basically Ryuji's 3rd tier skill, but for magic, and that's pretty great. However, her stats aren't quite as good as Yukiko's, and she's not a particularly good healer either. So yeah, that's why she's a tier just below Yukiko in B. Now, Yusuke is to Ryuji what Kanji is to Chie from Persona 4. A great physical attacker who not only lands most of his hits, but also has much better moves, along with some defensive skills like the counters, and a 3rd tier ability that is both useful and cost-effective, at least when compared to Chie's 3rd tier ability, which is basically the same thing. So yeah, I'm gonna keep this one short. Yusuke is the best physical attacker in P5. Speaking of characters being outright better than one another, we now have Makoto, who, unlike Morgana, actually is a good character and a better supporter and a better healer. Makoto's stats are pretty balanced, which isn't ideal offensively, but perfect for a defensive strategy, which is exactly what Makoto is best suited for. She gets multi-target healing moves, ailment healing moves, defense buffs, nuclear magic skills, and she can actually take hits before going down. Plus, her 3rd tier skill is great too. It's basically the same as Yusuke's, except it debuffs the enemy party instead, so not quite as useful, but still pretty useful. I will say the one thing Makoto is lacking in is that she doesn't learn Salvation, but I'll take that over having a healer that just dies in 1 or 2 hits. Now, Haru is going to be in... yeah, I'm going to put her in C. Haru is another jack-of-all-trades character, but to be honest, I've never really used her that much. I mean, it's cool that she specializes in both Sai and gun skills, and it's cool that she gets both the booster skills, but by the time she joined, I just didn't really need her. Gun skills aren't anywhere near as strong as physical skills at that point in the game, and it doesn't really help that she just doesn't have much in the way of healing skills aside from Amrita Shower, and Heat Riser isn't really all that helpful since it only works on one party member at a time. I did get some use out of her for beating random encounters when I had no other options, but I don't really know if that alone is enough to bring her higher than C tier. Alright, now on to Akechi, a fan favorite, and you are going to be in B. Normally, I would have put Akechi in A, but it's another similar case to Shinjiro where you don't really get to enjoy him for very long, but at least he's a better party member. His moveset is great. It's basically Naruto on steroids, and it also does help that you can use him again during the final dungeon in the 3rd semester of Royal. Plus, his 3rd tier skill is really good, but unfortunately, because of his limited uses, I can't really put him higher than B. And that also goes for our last character, Kasumi. Once again, Kasumi is a great character, both in terms of story and gameplay, and she actually has my favorite moveset out of the entire party, because of the way her moveset increases the critical rates of hers and the rest of the party's attacks, which is perfect for the late game when enemies have so few weaknesses. She also gets the best physical move in the game, and she's pretty good in terms of stats too. It only makes me wish we could have used her earlier. I mean, having her be the poster child for Persona 5 Royal and then only being able to use her in the last dungeon is just false advertising. I mean, there's even a part of the game where she offers to join you, but the game doesn't let you say yes. Probably because the animators were too lazy to edit her into the FMV cutscenes, but believe me when I say I want to put her higher, but her limited playtime only allows me to put her in B. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is my tier list for all the playable Persona characters throughout the entire series. Once again, I just want to make it clear that this tier list is not a characters tier list, it's not a waifu tier list or anything like that. This is purely based on how good these characters are in gameplay. And once again, this list is just my opinion. You are more than welcome to check out this tier list down below in the description and make your own. But as usual, guys, be sure to check out my other stuff in the description. Be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe, all that good stuff. And until the next video, I will see you all later.